In 1900, roughly 80% of American beef was slaughtered in Chicago. By 1980, Chicago was no longer a meaningful center of American meatpacking. That shift, from a single dominant processing center to a dispersed geography of large-format plants in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, did not happen since Chicago's workers became less productive or because the city's managers made a catastrophic strategic error. It happened because the logistics of moving beef changed, and when logistics change, the cities that relied on the old logistics have to adapt or lose ground. Understanding why Chicago's Union stock yards were once the organizing center of American meatpacking requires understanding how beef moved before refrigeration was reliable enough to change the system. Cattle were raised on the Great Plains and brought to Chicago by rail. The reason they came to Chicago wasn't that Chicago had some intrinsic advantage as a processing center. The reason was that the rail network converged there, and before refrigeration, moving a live animal was cheaper and more practical than moving a carcass. A live animal is self-regulating. It can survive days of transport with adequate water and feed. A carcass has no such resilience. It begins deteriorating immediately and calls for cold throughout the supply chain to remain saleable. Refrigeration technology of the 1870s and 1880s was not reliable or uniform enough to make carcass transport routine at scale. So the logical system was to bring the animal to the city, slaughter it there, and distribute the product within the cold storage radius that local ice and later mechanical refrigeration could maintain. Chicago sat at the convergence of rail lines from the cattle-producing Great Plains and the consuming markets of the East Coast. The Union Stock Yards, established in 1865, was the institutional expression of that logistics logic. It concentrated the animals, the slaughterhouses, the rendering operations, the ice packing facilities, and the labor required to turn cattle into beef in one dense district on Chicago's south side. The big four meatpackers, Swift, Armour, Morris, and Wilson, operated there since proximity to each other and to the yards was more efficient than isolation. Shared infrastructure, rail spurs, ice supply, waste rendering, skilled labor markets. The yards and their associated packing houses employed tens of thousands of workers, largely immigrant labor, in conditions that Upton Sinclair documented in The Jungle in 1906. The scale and density of the yards was an industrial achievement of the first order, but it was an achievement built on a specific logistics technology. The technology was live animal rail transport plus terminal city processing plus local cold distribution. When one element of that technology changed, the logic of the entire system had to be reconsidered. The element that changed was the refrigerated boxcar. Mechanical refrigeration in rail cars became reliable enough for long-distance carcass transport in the late 19th century. Gustavus Swift is usually credited with forcing the technology into commercial use. He invested in refrigerated rail cars and in the icehouse network along rail routes that was necessary to recharge them. Swift's insight was that if you could move a carcass reliably, you could move the slaughter to wherever the cattle were raised and save the transportation cost of a live animal. A steer loses significant weight in transit under stress. A carcass does not. You were shipping the product, not the potential product plus its biological overhead. The economic geography of the meatpacking industry before the refrigerated boxcar was not merely a matter of Chicago's institutional advantages. It was a product of the physics of moving large animals over long distances in a pre-refrigeration context. Cattle weighing 1,000 pounds or more could survive rail transport from Kansas or Nebraska to Chicago under reasonable conditions, water and feed provided, transit time measured in days rather than weeks. The animals arrived at Chicago's Union stock yards in good enough condition to be slaughtered and processed immediately. The yards had developed the infrastructure to handle millions of animals per year, holding pens organized by origin and lot, stock handlers who moved animals through the system efficiently, veterinary inspection facilities, water and feed supply at scale. This receiving infrastructure was an investment that represented decades of accumulated capital, and it organized the entire upstream supply chain around Chicago as the destination. Railroads built rate structures that incentivized live animal shipment to Chicago. Cattle producers built their operations around the assumption that Chicago was where the animals would be sold and slaughtered. The financial and commercial institutions that served the cattle trade, the commission merchants, the bankers, the insurance firms, concentrated in Chicago since the volume of transactions passing through the yards made Chicago the most efficient location for those services. This is what an industrial node looks like when it has achieved dominance. Not just the physical infrastructure of processing, but the full commercial and financial ecosystem that organizes itself around that processing volume. Breaking the node required not just a better logistics technology, the refrigerated boxcar, but a willingness to invest in the complementary infrastructure that the new technology required. Gustavus Swift understood this. The refrigerated boxcar alone was not sufficient. A refrigerated boxcar on a route with no ice houses to recharge, it was simply a slightly better insulated boxcar. Swift invested in a network of ice houses at regular intervals along the rail routes he intended to use, creating the infrastructure that made the boxcars operationally viable on long hauls. He also invested in distribution infrastructure at the destination end, refrigerated warehouses in eastern cities where the dressed beef could be held before delivery to retailers and hotels. This distribution infrastructure investment was capital-intensive and was resisted by the railroads, which had rate structures built around the assumption of live animal shipment. The railroads initially refused to carry Swift's refrigerated cars, correctly perceiving that dressed beef from the producing region threatened their revenue from live animal transport. Swift found smaller railroads willing to carry his cars on terms that worked for the new business model, and the larger railroads eventually followed when they realized that refusing to participate was costing them freight revenue without preventing the transformation. This episode of Railroad Resistance to the Refrigerated Boxcar is a useful reminder that industrial geography transformations don't happen simply because the new technology is superior. They happen when the superior technology finds institutional paths around the resistance of the existing system. Swift found those paths, and the system transformed. But the transformation of Chicago from dominant meatpacking center to marginal participant unfolded over most of the 20th century rather than immediately after Swift's initial investment. The Union Stock Yards reached peak volume in the early 20th century and remained a significant industrial site well into the mid-century. What eroded Chicago's position wasn't a single competitive blow, but a gradual shift in the economics of meatpacking that favored producing region plants as transportation infrastructure, refrigeration technology, and production organization all improved together. The IBP innovation of the 1960s accelerated the shift by combining the producing region location advantage with a production organization innovation. The fully mechanized disassembly line that broke every step of the butchering process into specialized tasks performed by workers with minimal training. Iowa Beef Processors, founded in Denison, Iowa in 1960 by Currier Holman and Andrew Anderson, built large-format, single-story slaughterhouses near feedlots in Iowa and Nebraska, using a disassembly line model that eliminated the skilled whole animal butcher from most steps in the process. The skill and wage premium attached to whole animal butchery was eliminated. New workers in IBP's Iowa plants could be hired at lower wages, trained quickly, and replaced more easily than the skilled Chicago butchers whose craft knowledge had previously been essential to the business. The boxed beef system, where beef was cut and packaged at the processing plant rather than at the terminal market or the retailer, shifted even more value-added work to the producing region. Boxed beef required cold storage, but eliminated the skilled butcher at the retail or wholesale, and since most cutting had already been done. The cost advantage of this system over the Chicago model was substantial and compounding. Lower labor costs in producing region plants, combined with lower transportation costs from proximity to the cattle supply, produced a cost structure that Chicago's integrated stockyard and packing house system could not match. Rochester, Kansas; Garden City, Kansas; Dakota City, Nebraska; Denison, Iowa. These became processing centers not for any geographic charm. Rather, they sat close to the feedlot geography that had developed around grain-fed beef production in the Great Plains and Upper Midwest. Chicago's terminal city processing advantage had inverted. The distance from supply that had been acceptable when live animals traveled by rail was now an unnecessary cost when carcasses could travel efficiently in refrigerated trucks and rail cars. IBP and its competitors built plants where the cattle were, reducing the double transport cost of moving animals to a terminal city and then distributing product back toward consuming markets. Chicago's Union Stockyards closed in 1971. The closure was not catastrophic for Chicago as a whole. The city's economy was already far more diversified than its meat industry identity suggested. Still, for the Southside Stockyards neighborhood, for the Southside communities organized around stockyard employment, the closure was a substantial structural blow. The labor geography of the stockyards had concentrated immigrant and working-class populations in an area whose retail, housing, and civic infrastructure were built to serve the yard's workers. When those workers were no longer employed there, the consumption base that sustained the neighborhood shrank, and the neighborhood entered a long period of disinvestment. The new meatpacking geography produced its own labor consequences. IBP and its successors recruited labor aggressively in the rural Midwest and, increasingly, from immigrant populations. Initially, Southeast Asian refugees resettled in the 1970s and 1980s, later Mexican and Central American migrants. Towns like Storm Lake, Iowa, and Garden City, Kansas, experienced rapid demographic transformation as meatpacking plants hired substantial numbers of workers in communities that had previously been predominantly white and rural. The labor conditions in these new plants were in some respects as difficult as those Sinclair had documented in Chicago. Repetitive motion injury rates were high. Turnover was high. Housing availability was strained by rapid population growth. The geographic redistribution of meatpacking didn't simply move jobs and keep everything else constant. That created new social geographies in communities that had no prior experience absorbing large, culturally distinct migrant labor populations. The communities that had invited meatpacking plants for the employment they would bring found that employment brought social changes that the communities had not anticipated and weren't always prepared to manage. Cold storage infrastructure itself turned into an economic geography question. The logistics of boxed beef, refrigerated trucking, cold storage warehouse networks, distribution center geography produced a new set of place dependencies. Rail had organized Chicago's dominance. Truck-based cold chain logistics organized the new geography differently, favoring highway interchange proximity, flat land for large footprint processing plants, and water access for processing operations. The towns and cities that developed cold chain infrastructure, the refrigerated warehouse operators, the specialized trucking firms, the maintenance and repair businesses that served the equipment, gained employment and investment tied to the logistics network rather than directly to the processing plants. This secondary infrastructure geography added depth to the economic transformation. The meatpacking geography shift was not merely a movement of a single industry from one set of cities to another. It was a reorganization of the entire food production and distribution system from a terminal city model, in which processing and distribution were co-located at rail-served urban centers, to a distributed model in which processing was decentralized toward production and distribution was handled by a truck-based network serving consumers wherever they lived. The Union Stockyards closure in 1971 was the formal end of Chicago's role as the organizing center of this system. But the system had already been reorganizing around the new geography for more than a decade before the yards closed. The closure was a recognition of a transformation that had already occurred rather than the cause of a transformation just beginning. The pattern of anchor plant departure, community contraction, and long-term disinvestment that characterized the South Side Stockyards district after 1971 is structurally similar to what happened in Youngstown's steelworker neighborhoods after Black Monday. The specific industry was different. The product, the logistics, the labor history, and the technology were all different. Still, the structural dynamic, a community organized around a single industrial employer, losing that employer, and struggling to replace the organizing logic, was the same. The cold storage corridor built a new industrial geography. That new geography built new communities organized around its own production logic. Those communities are now several generations old, and their futures depend on whether the production logic that built them continues to organize the industry or whether another technological shift reorganizes the geography again. The chicken and pork processing industries followed a similar geographic logic, with processing concentrated near grain and livestock production in the South and Midwest rather than at terminal markets. The consolidation of the meatpacking industry itself, through acquisitions that reduced the number of major beef packers to a very small number of firms controlling the majority of kill capacity, further concentrated economic power in ways that have affected the producers supplying the plants and the workers inside them. The structure of the American beef industry today, for major packers controlling roughly 85% of the market, plants of enormous scale in producing regions, a largely immigrant and migrant workforce, is the product of the same logistics and production geography revolution that the refrigerated boxcar initiated and IBP accelerated. Understanding where meat comes from today calls for understanding how the geography of production moved, why it moved, and what that movement meant for the places that lost the industry and the places that gained it. The cold chain made it possible. The economics made it inevitable. And the geography that resulted is the lasting physical record of a logistics revolution that changed where American food is processed and who processes it. The story of Upton Sinclair and the jungle deserves mention in any account of Chicago's meatpacking geography, not because the novel's most famous effect, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, was what Sinclair had intended, yet because it documents the social geography of the stockyard district at a moment of peak industrial density. Sinclair had intended to write about labor conditions, about the exploitation of immigrant workers, about the wage structure and physical danger of meatpacking work. The public and Congress focused instead on the food safety implications of what he described: contaminated meat, unsanitary processing conditions, adulterated products. Sinclair's famous remark, that he aimed for the public's heart and hit its stomach, captures the mismatch between his intention and the political response. Still, the novel's value as industrial geography documentation is independent of its political impact. Sinclair described in detail what the stockyard district looked like, how it functioned, what the labor geography of immigrant settlement looked like in the neighborhoods adjacent to the yards, and what the industrial logic of the packing house system was from the inside. The Lithuanian immigrant family at the heart of the novel was fictitious, but was drawn from Sinclair's direct observation of real workers and real conditions. The yards he described were physically real. The conditions he documented were corroborated by contemporaneous investigation, and the neighborhood geography he depicted, the crowded boarding houses, the ethnic commercial streets, the proximity of housing to slaughter, accurately reflected the urban social geography of industrial Chicago at the turn of the century. Reading The Jungle as industrial geography rather than as labor manifesto reveals something substantial. The terminal city processing model created a specific kind of urban district that was dense, ethnically diverse, physically difficult, and economically organized around a single industrial employer's labor demand. The South Side Stockyards neighborhood wasn't a neighborhood that happened to be near the yards. It was a neighborhood that existed because of the yards, was shaped by the yards' labor demand, and would eventually be reshaped by the yards' departure. The labor history of Chicago's meatpacking industry between Sinclair's novel and the yard's closure in 1971 is a history of organizing, strikes, interracial coalition, and the eventual achievement of union recognition and improved working conditions. The Congress of Industrial Organizations and the United Packing House Workers of America organized the packing houses in the 1930s and 1940s, winning union recognition after difficult campaigns that involved racial coalition between black and white workers, a notable achievement in a period when racial division was routinely used by employers to prevent organizing. The United Packing House Workers became one of the most progressive unions in the CIO, taking positions on civil rights and racial equality that went beyond what many other unions were willing to support. The wages and conditions that union organization produced for Chicago's meatpacking workers were a genuine improvement from the Sinclair era, and they made meatpacking employment in Chicago a path to working-class stability for multiple generations of immigrant and black workers. This labor history context matters for understanding what the geographic shift of meatpacking to producing region plants meant. The shift was more than a movement of jobs from Chicago to Iowa and Kansas. It was a movement of jobs from a unionized, relatively well-compensated workforce to a non-union, lower-compensated workforce. IBP's explicit strategy of building plants in rural areas where union organizing had less institutional support, and its resistance to union recognition campaigns, meant that the new meatpacking geography was also a new labor relations geography. The wages in IBP's Iowa plants weren't comparable to what the United Packing House workers had won for Chicago workers. The benefits, the safety standards, and the grievance procedures that union contracts provided in Chicago weren't available in the new plants. This labor dimension of the geographic shift has been documented by historians of the meatpacking industry as a deliberate component of IBP's competitive strategy. Lower labor costs were achievable not just through rural location, but through avoiding the union contracts that Chicago's workers had won. The mix of geographic relocation and labor relations reset allowed the new producing region plants to compete at price points that Chicago's unionized plants could not match. The Chicago plants didn't simply fail to match IBP's location economics. They also could not match IBP's labor economics, because the union contracts that their workers had won through decades of organizing represented costs that the new plants didn't carry. This is a recurring pattern in American industrial geography. Geographic relocation serves as a mechanism for resetting labor relations, allowing producers to escape the institutional legacy of union organization by moving to locations where that organization has less history and less density. The agricultural and food processing sectors have used this pattern repeatedly, and meatpacking is one of the most clearly documented cases. The workers who followed the industry to its new locations, the Southeast Asian refugees of the 1970s and 1980s, the Mexican and Central American migrants of the 1990s and 2000s, were choosing among limited options. Meatpacking work in Garden City, Kansas, or Worthington, Minnesota offered wages that were higher than what was available in their home countries or in the economic context they were leaving. The relative attractiveness of the wages didn't mean the conditions were safe or the treatment was fair. Turnover rates in IBP's plants ran at 100% or more per year in some facilities, indicating the difficulty of retaining workers in conditions that many found unsustainable. Repetitive motion injuries, the carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, and cumulative trauma disorders that result from performing the same cutting motion thousands of times per shift, affected large proportions of the workforce. The occupational injury rates in the new meatpacking plants were among the highest in American manufacturing, and they remained high despite regulatory attention and OSHA inspections. The Human Rights Watch report of 2004, Blood, Sweat, and Fear, documented the labor conditions in American meat and poultry processing in detail that Sinclair's account of Chicago's packing houses a century earlier had documented in its own era. The geography had changed. The technology had changed. The workers were from different countries and spoke different languages. Still, some of the structural features of meatpacking work, the tangible danger, the low wages relative to the demands of the work, the limited power of workers to improve their conditions, had proven more durable than the geography that changed around them. The cold storage technology that enabled the geographic shift did not improve the conditions of the workers who operated inside the geography it created. It moved them, and it changed the institutional context around them, yet it did not solve the fundamental tension between the economics of high-volume, low-margin food processing and the human cost of the work required to produce that food. The geography of American beef processing today remains concentrated in the producing region corridor that IBP built in the 1960s and 1970s. For companies, JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and National Beef control roughly 85% of the fed cattle slaughter capacity in the United States. Their plants are large format, producing region facilities whose locations reflect the feedlot geography that IBP targeted 60 years ago. The workforce in those plants continues to be drawn substantially from immigrant and migrant populations. The union presence varies by plant and company, with some facilities covered by United Food and Commercial Workers contracts and others operating non-union. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 exposed the concentration risk inherent in the producing region large format plant model. When several large plants were forced to reduce operations or close temporarily due to workforce illness, the impact on national beef supply was immediate and visible. The geographic concentration that had been an efficiency advantage in normal operations became a fragility in a system-wide disruption. The parallel to the integrated steel mill's efficiency versus rigidity dynamic is not exact, but it is instructive. Concentration produces efficiency. Concentration also creates fragility when the conditions that made it efficient change. The meatpacking geography story is, in this respect, not finished. The cold chain that moved the industry from Chicago to the producing corridor has been operating for half a century, and the geography it created is mature and entrenched. Yet the forces that could reorganize it, automation, alternative protein sources, regulatory changes, labor cost pressures, are present and active. Whether the next geographic reorganization of American meatpacking will look like the IBP revolution of the 1960s, or will take a different form, is a question whose answer will be determined by the same interaction of technology, logistics economics, and institutional path dependency that determined what happened to Chicago's Union stockyards. The cold chain made the first transformation possible. What makes the next transformation possible is still being determined. Chicago's stockyards are gone. The South Side Stockyards neighborhood has rebuilt itself, imperfectly, around a different economic logic. The producing region plants continue to operate at enormous scale. The workers inside them are, in many cases, the grandchildren of the migrants who came to fill the plants that IBP built. And the geography that organized all of this, the feedlot corridor, the plant locations, the cold chain infrastructure, the distribution network, continues to determine what American beef costs, where it comes from, and whose labor produced it. The structure of the Union stockyards as a tangible institution deserves more attention than it typically receives in accounts focused on the competitive dynamics between Chicago and the producing region plants. The yards weren't simply a large facility for animal handling. They were a financial market, a commercial exchange, and a social institution whose functions extended well beyond the physical processing of animals. The Livestock Exchange Building, constructed in 1875 and rebuilt after fires, housed the offices of hundreds of commission merchants, livestock dealers, bankers, and service firms whose business was the buying and selling of cattle, hogs, and sheep at the terminal market. A cattle producer in Nebraska who shipped animals to Chicago was consigning them to a commission merchant who would sell them on the producer's behalf at the yards, deducting a commission from the sale price. The price discovery function of the yards, the determination of what cattle were worth at any given moment, was one of the central economic functions of the institution. Prices set at the Chicago yards influenced cattle prices across the entire producing region, since the yards were the dominant terminal market and their prices served as the reference point against which all other cattle transactions were measured. When the yards closed, and when the buying pattern shifted to direct procurement by the large producing region packers, the price discovery mechanism of the terminal market was lost. Cattle prices became negotiated between producers and the handful of large packers who controlled most of the slaughter capacity, rather than being determined in a competitive terminal market where many buyers and sellers met. This shift in price discovery has been a persistent concern of cattle producers and agricultural economists since the 1970s, and it is one of the less discussed consequences of the geographic transformation that the refrigerated boxcar initiated. The terminal market's price transparency was a genuine service to the cattle industry, and its loss, which was a direct consequence of the shift to producing region plants and direct procurement, contributed to the market power concerns that have surrounded the large meat packers ever since. The Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration, the federal agency established in 1921 to regulate livestock markets and packing house practices, has been periodically engaged with the market power questions that the concentration of the packing industry has raised. The Packers and Stockyards Act, which that agency administers, was built for a market structure built around terminal markets and commission merchants. As the industry shifted to direct procurement and regional concentration, the regulatory framework's adequacy for the new market structure became a persistent question. These regulatory and market structure dimensions of the meatpacking geography story are part of the full account of what changed when the cold chain moved the industry. The geographic shift was not merely a change in where processing happened. It was a change in the commercial structure of the industry, in the labor relations of the industry, in the market power balance between producers and packers, and in the regulatory framework within which the industry operated. All of these changes were enabled, ultimately, by the cold storage technology that made producing region processing economically superior to terminal city processing. This is what industrial geography transformations actually involve. not just the physical relocation of production, but the restructuring of the commercial, labor, and regulatory institutions that were organized around the old geography. The full accounting of what the refrigerated boxcar changed, from Gustavus Swift's first refrigerated car in the 1870s to the market structure of the beef industry today, is a more complete story than any single factor can tell. The technology enabled the transformation. The economics motivated it. The institutional path dependency of the old system slowed it. And the human consequences of the transformation, for Chicago's South Side neighborhoods, for the small towns that gained meatpacking plants, for the workers who filled those plants, are the lasting record of what a logistics revolution actually costs and produces in human terms. The cold chain built an industry. It also built communities, reshaped labor markets, concentrated market power, and produced vulnerabilities whose full implications are still being worked out. That is the full scope of what it means to say that a logistics technology changed where American beef comes from. The role of refrigeration technology in American food geography extends well beyond meatpacking. Yet meatpacking was the industry where refrigeration first demonstrated that it could reorganize an entire national production geography rather than simply improving conditions within an existing one. The pattern that the beef industry established, terminal city concentration replaced by producing region distribution, repeated itself across multiple food sectors over the following century. Poultry processing, which had been geographically diffused through mid-century, consolidated into large-format producing region plants in the Southeast, particularly in Arkansas and North Carolina, as vertical integration and refrigerated logistics enabled the same efficiency gains that beef had experienced. Fresh produce distribution, which had depended on terminal markets in large cities as the clearinghouses for regional agricultural output, was gradually reorganized around direct procurement from large growers and refrigerated distribution center networks that bypassed the terminal market model. The supermarket chains that grew to dominance in the post-war period built their own distribution infrastructure, refrigerated warehouses at strategic locations in highway networks that allowed them to procure directly from producers and processors and to route product efficiently to their store networks. The integrated cold chain that resulted, from farm or processing plant to distribution center to store, reflected the same logic that Gustavus Swift had applied to beef. Put the cold where it needs to be, and the geography of processing follows. What the cold chain enabled, in its fully developed form, was the decoupling of production geography from consumption geography at a scale and reliability that had not previously been possible. Before refrigeration, food production had to be located near consumption since the perishable nature of most food limited transport distance. After refrigeration, fully reliable, truck-based, distributed through a national network of cold storage facilities. Food production could be located wherever it was cheapest to produce, as long as cold chain integrity could be maintained from production to sale. This decoupling was one of the major structural changes in the American economy during the 20th century, and its effects on the geography of agriculture, food processing, retail, and employment have been profound. The communities that gained processing activity because of cold chain decoupling, the poultry towns of Arkansas, the produce processing hubs of the Central Valley, the meatpacking cities of the Great Plains, are the geographic beneficiaries of a technology that also devastated the terminal city communities that had previously organized food processing at urban nodes. And the workers who fill the processing plants in those communities are the human expression of the same labor geography logic that filled Chicago's packing houses a century earlier. Workers with limited alternatives accepting difficult work at wages that are higher than what they could earn elsewhere, in conditions that are better or worse depending on the regulatory and labor relations context of the specific plant and time. The geography changes. The product changes. The workers change. The structural tension between the economics of high-volume food processing and the human cost of the work required to produce it has proven more durable than any of the geographic or technological changes that have reorganized the industry around it. This is what the meatpacking geography story ultimately reveals. The cold chain was a technology of efficiency, and it worked. It moved the industry to where production was cheapest. It reduced the price of moving beef from cattle to consumer. It made beef more affordable and more widely available than the terminal city system could have achieved at comparable scale. Yet efficiency in the aggregate is not the same as equity in the distribution. The efficiency gains from the geographic reorganization weren't distributed evenly among the producers who raised the cattle, the workers who processed them, the communities that housed the plants, and the consumers who bought the product. The geography of those gains and losses is a map of power, not just a map of logistics. And reading that map honestly requires following the cold chain all the way back to the Mahoning Valley or boats, the Springfield stockyards, the Gustavus Swift ice houses, and the IBP plant in Denison, Iowa, where the modern geography of American beef processing began. The structural transformation that the refrigerated boxcar initiated in American meatpacking geography also illustrates something broader about how logistics innovations interact with the spatial organization of industries. Logistics innovations, new transport modes, new cold chain capabilities, new distribution infrastructure, don't simply make the existing industrial geography more efficient. They change which locations have competitive advantages and which have competitive liabilities. The live animal rail network that organized Chicago's dominance was perfectly adapted to the pre-refrigeration logistics regime. When the refrigeration regime replaced it, the network's configuration became irrelevant for the new competitive logic. Chicago didn't become a worse location for meatpacking. It turned into a location whose advantages in the old regime were not the advantages that mattered in the new one. This pattern, a location that was optimal for one logistics regime becoming suboptimal for its successor, appears across many sectors and many historical periods. The waterfront cities that organized around canal transportation lost their advantage when rail superseded canals. The rail hub cities that organized around rail freight lost their advantage when trucking networks superseded rail for short-haul distribution. Chicago's stockyard city loss to IBP's producing region plants is another iteration of the same structural dynamic. The lesson is not that cities and communities should be skeptical of building around logistics nodes. Logistics nodes create genuine economic advantages that can be exploited for decades. The lesson is that logistics regimes change, and communities that have organized their industrial geography around a specific logistics regime should be attentive to the conditions under which that regime can be displaced. The producing region meatpacking geography that IBP produced is itself a logistics regime. It is organized around the highway-based refrigerated truck network and the feedlot geography of the Great Plains. If that regime were to change, through automation that changes the cost geography of processing, through alternative protein sources that change where food production occurs, through climate change that alters where cattle can be raised economically, the producing region plants would face the same structural challenge that Chicago's stockyards faced when refrigeration changed the optimal location for meatpacking. Every industrial geography that works well is also, in this sense, a potential victim of the logistics or technology change that could make it work less well. The cold chain built the current geography. Something else